A single mom and her autistic son were publicly humiliated on a crowded bus, and when the bullying turned physical, everyone looked away. But one man, sitting silently in the corner, stood up. What happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about strength, courage, and who the real heroes are. This is a story you won't forget. The number 42 bus in downtown Chicago was less a vehicle and more a pressure cooker of humidity and exhaustion. The air conditioning had died 3 stops ago, leaving 50 strangers to marinate in a soup of sweat, diesel fumes, and unspoken irritation. For Sarah, clutching the metal pole with a white-knuckled grip, the heat was the least of her worries. She wasn't just guarding her groceries. She was guarding the fragile ecosystem of her 10-year-old son, Leo. Leo pressed his forehead against the grimy glass, his eyes tracking the blur of concrete passing by at 30 miles per hour. To anyone else, he was just a boy looking out a window. But Sarah knew he was calculating patterns in the chaos. His fingers drummed a frantic, complex rhythm against his thigh, a silent symphony that kept his anxiety at bay. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. It was his anchor in a world that was too loud, too bright, and far too unpredictable. Sarah shifted her stance, trying to use her body as a physical barrier between Leo and the crowded aisle. Her feet ached from a double shift at the diner, but her maternal radar was pinging with high alert intensity. She scanned the faces around them, a businessman scrolling angrily on his phone, a grandmother asleep with her mouth open, looking for the spark of annoyance that usually preceded a confrontation. She had become an expert at apologizing for her son's existence before he even made a sound. The bus lurched forward with a metallic groan, throwing passengers off balance and causing a collective sigh of frustration. Leo didn't stumble. He swayed perfectly in time with the machine, as if he were part of the engine itself. He let out a low, humming sound, a vibration deep in his throat that matched the pitch of the idling motor. It was a self-soothing mechanism, harmless and soft, yet in the suffocating silence of the stalled traffic, it sounded like a siren to Sarah's terrified ears. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent code they had practiced 1,000 times at home. Quiet hands, quiet voice. Leo paused for a second, his rhythm broken, and looked up at her with eyes as clear and wide as an ocean. He didn't understand the social contract of public silence. He only knew that the bus was singing to him, and it was rude not to sing back. The innocence in his gaze broke her heart because she knew the world wouldn't see a child singing. They would see a problem to be solved. 3 rows back, the atmosphere shifted from indifferent to predatory, a change Sarah felt on the back of her neck before she saw it. A group of 4 teenagers sat sprawled across the back bench, their laughter sharp and jagged like broken glass. They weren't looking at their phones anymore. Their eyes were locked on Leo's rhythmic rocking. It started with a whisper, a nudge, a pointed finger that acted as the target designator for their boredom. Sarah tightened her grip on Leo, silently praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that the light would turn green. Just 2 more stops. That was all she needed. 5 minutes of mercy. But the universe seemed determined to test her breaking point today. One of the boys in the back began to rock back and forth, mocking Leo's movements with exaggerated, grotesque jerks. His friends snickered, a low rumble of cruelty that cut through the humidity. Leo, sensing the movement in his peripheral vision, turned his head and saw the boy mimicking him. He didn't see malice. He saw a mirror. A wide, genuine smile broke across his face, and he rocked harder, thinking he had finally found a friend who spoke his language. This reaction, so pure and devoid of defense, acted like blood in the water for sharks. The laughter from the back grew louder, bolder, transforming from private amusement to public spectacle. Sarah felt the familiar burn of tears stinging her eyes, but she swallowed them down, turning them into steel in her spine. She couldn't afford to be weak. She had to be the wall. She dared to look around at the other passengers, hoping for an ally, a sympathetic glance, anything. But the businessman turned up his volume, and the sleeping woman shifted away. The bystander effect was in full force. Everyone saw, but nobody was willing to step into the line of fire. Yet, there was one person who didn't fit the pattern of indifference, a variable Sarah hadn't calculated. Sitting directly across from the teenagers was a massive figure, huddled in a dirty, oversized winter coat despite the July heat. He wore heavy, industrial-grade headphones and sat with his eyes squeezed shut, vibrating with a tension that seemed ready to snap. He looked dangerous, unstable, the kind of person you cross the street to avoid. The man in the coat wasn't looking at the teenagers, but his hand was clenched so tightly on his knee that his knuckles were white. He was rocking too, a microscopic movement barely visible to the naked eye, perfectly synced with Leo's rhythm. Sarah glossed over him, cataloging him as another potential threat, another unstable element in a volatile chemical equation. She didn't know that he was the only other person on that bus who could hear the frequency of her son's fear. "Hey, Space Cadet!" The voice boomed from the back, shattering the fragile peace. The leader of the group, a boy with a cruel jawline and expensive sneakers, stood up in the aisle. He wasn't satisfied with mocking from a distance. He wanted a reaction. The air in the bus seemed to leave the vehicle, leaving a vacuum where only the sound of Leo's humming remained. Sarah stepped in front of her son, her body trembling not with fear, but with a mother's primal rage. The bus driver checked the rearview mirror, saw the confrontation brewing, and made a calculated decision to keep his eyes on the road. The traffic light remained stubbornly red, trapping them in this metal cage. Sarah realized with terrifying clarity that help wasn't coming. She was alone in a city of millions, standing between her beautiful, misunderstood boy and the ugliness of human nature. The silence of the good people around her was deafening, louder than any insult. Have you ever felt the weight of a stranger's judgment pressing down on you, paralyzed by the fear that no one would stand by your side if you screamed? Tell me in the comments below if you've ever been the one watching in silence, or the one praying for a voice. As the teenager took a menacing step toward them, raising his hand not to strike, but to invade their space, the man in the winter coat suddenly opened his eyes. They weren't angry, they were terrified, and they were looking straight at Leo. The boy in the expensive sneakers didn't shout. He leaned in with a smirk that was far more cutting than a scream, invading the invisible boundary Sarah had desperately tried to maintain. "Does he talk, or is he just broken?" he sneered, the question hanging in the stale air like toxic smoke. The bus went deathly quiet, the kind of silence where you can hear the hum of the tires on the asphalt, waiting for the inevitable crash. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, a sharp intake of air that felt like swallowing glass. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, the automatic scripts she had rehearsed for years, but the words died on her tongue. Her eyes darted to Leo. He had stopped humming. His hands, usually a flurry of motion, froze mid-air. The sudden stillness of a child who is never still is a terrifying thing to witness. It's the calm before a catastrophic storm. Leo wasn't looking at the bully. He was staring at the floor, his shoulders beginning to rise and fall in a rapid, jagged rhythm. Sarah knew the signs instantly. Sensory overload. The proximity of the stranger, the malice in his tone, the collective stare of 50 people. It was all crashing down on him at once. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, just leave us alone." "We're just asking a question, lady," the teenager laughed, playing to his audience in the back row. "Maybe he needs a reboot." He reached out, his finger hovering inches from Leo's face, a deliberate provocation designed to elicit a reaction he could then mock. The cruelty wasn't impulsive, it was a calculated performance, and Leo was just the prop. That was the moment the atmosphere in the bus shifted from uncomfortable to dangerous. The man in the winter coat, who had been a statue of misery in the corner, moved. It wasn't a heroic leap. It was a slow, heavy unfolding of limbs, like a dormant mountain waking up. He stood up, his massive frame blocking out the light from the window, casting a long shadow over the aisle. The noise-canceling headphones were pulled down around his neck, revealing scars behind his ears that hinted at a lifetime of scratching. He didn't look at the bully. He didn't look at Sarah. His gaze was fixed intently on a spot on the ceiling, his brow furrowed in deep concentration, as if he were trying to solve a complex equation in his head. 120 decibels, he stated. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection, yet it carried a weight that vibrated through the floorboards. The pitch of your laughter combined with the engine noise is 120 decibels. It causes physical pain. The bully blinked, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. This wasn't the reaction he expected. He was prepared for anger, for fear, for a fight, but not for data. "What are you talking about, freak?" he shot back, trying to regain his footing. He puffed out his chest, relying on the bravado that had served him well in the schoolyard. But he had miscalculated. He was no longer dealing with social norms. He was dealing with raw, unfiltered honesty. The man took a step forward. He moved with a strange, shuffling gait, his heavy boots dragging slightly on the rubber matting. He was trembling, Sarah realized. His hands were shaking violently at his sides, not from rage, but from the immense effort it took to exist in this moment. "You are standing in his yellow zone," the man continued, still staring at the ceiling. "You are pushing him into the red. When he goes red, he cannot come back. You need to step back. Now." It was a warning, but it sounded like a diagnosis. The bully laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that grated on everyone's nerves. "Or what? You gonna make me?" He shoved the man's shoulder, a mistake that rippled through the bus like a shockwave. The man didn't stumble. He didn't even flinch. He simply slowly lowered his gaze from the ceiling until it rested, heavy and unblinking, on the teenager's forehead. In that gaze there was no anger, no hatred. There was only a profound, exhausted recognition. It was the look of someone who has stared into the abyss of human cruelty for 40 years and survived. "I don't want to make you," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. "I want you to stop being the noise." Leo let out a sharp, high-pitched cry, covering his ears with his hands. The sound was like a signal flare. The man in the coat flinched, as if he had been slapped, closing his eyes tight for a second. When he opened them, the detachment was gone. He reached into the deep pocket of his coat, his hand moving with sudden, terrifying speed. The bully scrambled back, tripping over his own feet, expecting a weapon. The passengers gasped, shrinking into their seats. Have you ever misjudged someone so completely that the truth felt like a physical blow? We categorize people instantly: victim, villain, hero, outcast. But what happens when the boxes we build are too small for the reality inside them? Share a time in the comments when you were wrong about someone at first glance. The man's hand emerged from his pocket, but it wasn't holding a knife or a gun. It was clutching a small, battered object that caught the dim light of the bus. The object in the man's hand was a toy car. It was an old, die-cast model, the paint chipped away to reveal the dull gray metal underneath, its wheels worn smooth from years of anxious spinning. He held it out not as a weapon, but as an offering, his trembling hand bridging the gap between two worlds that the bully could never understand. The silence on the bus shifted again, morphing from fear into a collective, bewildered confusion. "It's a '67 Mustang," the man said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and reverence. He wasn't speaking to the bully anymore. He was speaking to the air, to the vibration in the room. The wheels, they spin perfectly. No friction. Friction is bad. Friction makes noise. He spun the wheel with his thumb, a tiny whir sound that seemed to cut through the tension like a laser. The bully stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his aggressive script completely derailed. He had no comeback for a toy car. He looked around at his friends for backup, but they were looking at the floor, suddenly finding their shoelaces fascinating. The man in the coat ignored them all. He took a hesitant step toward Leo, moving with the exaggerated caution one uses when approaching a frightened animal. Sarah's instinct was to block him, to shield her son from this strange, giant man. But then she saw Leo's face. He wasn't looking at the man's dirty coat or his imposing size. He was locked onto the spinning wheel of the car. His crying had stopped, replaced by a hiccuping breath as his brain latched onto the repetitive, soothing motion. It was a language he spoke fluently. "He likes the spin," the man whispered, finally risking a glance at Sarah. His eyes were a startlingly pale blue, swimming with unshed tears. "I know he likes the spin because the world stops when it spins." He slowly lowered himself to one knee, a painful process that made his joints crack, bringing himself down to Leo's eye level. He didn't force eye contact. He looked at the car, inviting Leo to look with him. "My son," the man started, and then his voice broke. It was a crack in the dam, a fissure that let decades of pain seep through. He cleared his throat and started again, reciting facts like a shield. "My son had a blue one. Blue is a calming color. Red is angry. This one is silver. Silver is neutral." He placed the car gently on the ribbed rubber floor of the bus, giving it a little push. It rolled smoothly toward Leo's sneakers. The bully, sensing his dominance evaporating, tried to reclaim the narrative. "Oh, great. Now we have two retards playing with toys," he muttered, though the venom was gone, replaced by insecurity. The insult hung in the air, weak and pathetic. The man didn't react with anger this time. He stopped the car with one finger and looked up, not at the boy's face, but at his chest, as if reading his heart. "You use words like blunt instruments," the man said softly. "Because you are empty, you echo. Empty spaces always echo the loudest." And it wasn't an insult, it was an observation, delivered with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. The passengers turned to look at the teenager, and for the first time, they didn't see a threat. They saw a child in expensive clothes, posturing to hide his own hollowness. Leo reached out. His small, pale hand hovered over the car, his fingers twitching. He looked at the man, really looked at him, and saw the headphones around his neck. Leo tapped his own ear. The man nodded solemnly. "Too loud," the man agreed. "The world is too loud." It was a moment of perfect, crystalline connection, a secret handshake between two members of a club no one else wanted to join. Sarah felt a sob rise in her throat, a mixture of relief and overwhelming sadness. She realized she had judged this man just as harshly as the world judged her son. She had seen the dirty coat and the size, and assumed danger. She hadn't seen the gentleness, the shared struggle, the scars of a battle fought in a sensory war zone every single day. The man gently pushed the car closer until it touched the tip of Leo's shoe. "He didn't make it," the man whispered to Sarah, the words barely audible over the idling engine. "My boy, the noise, the pressure. He ran into the street because the noise in his head was louder than the horn." A single tear tracked a clean line through the grime on his cheek. "I couldn't save him," he confessed, his large hands trembling as they hovered near the floor. "I was too loud, too. I tried to make him normal. I tried to make him stop spinning." He looked at Leo, who was now rolling the car back and forth, completely absorbed, his anxiety melting away with every rotation of the wheels. "I was wrong. The spinning is the safety." The bully sat down. He slumped into his seat, the air completely let out of his tires. The bus driver, who had been watching in the mirror, finally cleared his throat and hit the button to open the doors, even though they weren't at a stop yet. The fresh air rushed in, breaking the suffocating seal of the bus, but nobody moved to leave. They were witnessing a sacrament. "You're not broken," the man said to Leo, though he was looking at the car. "And you're not wrong." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a second car, this one red. He placed it next to the silver one. "We just have different engines." He looked at Sarah then, and for the first time his gaze was steady, anchored by a profound purpose. "Don't let them fix him. He doesn't need fixing. He needs a highway. The bully, a boy whose name no one would ever know, was the first to flee. He scrambled off the bus with the frantic urgency of an animal exposed to light, his head bowed, his expensive sneakers scuffing the dirty steps in his haste. His friends followed in a clumsy, silent procession of shame, their bravado gone, replaced by the hollow discomfort of being on the wrong side of a moral equation. The open doors didn't just let in fresh air, they let the poison out. For a long moment, the only sounds were the bus engine's low rumble and the quiet whir of the toy car's wheels on the rubber floor. Then, a woman who had been pretending to be asleep, a grandmother with kind, wrinkled eyes, reached into her handbag. She pulled out a small, crinkled packet of tissues and held it out to Sarah. Her hand was steady, her gaze unwavering. It wasn't just a tissue. It was an apology for her previous silence. Sarah accepted it, her fingers brushing the woman's papery skin. The simple human contact was an anchor, grounding her in the emotional storm. She wiped her eyes, no longer bothering to hide the tears. They were not tears of weakness anymore, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude that felt like a dam breaking inside her chest. She looked at the man still kneeling by her son, a giant figure hunched over a tiny silver car. He seemed to be shrinking back into himself, the monumental effort of the confrontation leaving him visibly drained. His shoulders slumped, and the intense focus in his eyes softened into a distant, hazy exhaustion. He was like a battery that had poured all its charge into one brilliant flash of light and was now spent. He slowly retrieved his red car, but left the silver Mustang near Leo's foot, a silent offering. "Thank you," Sarah managed to say, the words thick and clumsy in her throat. I don't know what to say." The man simply nodded, refusing to meet her eyes. He reached for his headphones, preparing to slip them back over his ears, to rebuild the wall of silence that made his world bearable. The interaction was over. The shield was going back up. But before he could retreat completely, the businessman who had been angrily scrolling on his phone cleared his throat, his voice surprisingly loud in the quiet bus. "That was not okay," he said, directing his words to the empty space where the bullies had been. "What they did. That was not okay." He then looked at Sarah, a flicker of genuine regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry. I should have said something." This second voice seemed to break a spell. A young woman near the front chimed in. "My nephew's on the spectrum. People can be so ignorant." Suddenly, stories began to trickle through the bus, quiet confessions of shared experiences, of cousins and brothers and neighbors' children. The bus was no longer a collection of 50 strangers. It had become a mobile support group bound by a moment of shared humanity. Sarah felt enveloped by an unexpected warmth. She had boarded this bus feeling utterly alone, an island in a hostile sea. Now she was part of an archipelago, connected by invisible bridges of empathy that had been forged in the fire of another's kindness. She looked at Leo, who was carefully lining up the silver Mustang with a crack in the floor, completely at peace in his own world, protected by the bubble this stranger had created. The man finally pushed himself to his feet, a laborious, aching process. He swayed for a moment, steadying his large frame on a metal pole. He was preparing to get off at the next stop, his mission complete, ready to melt back into the anonymity of the city. He was a ghost who had appeared just long enough to right a small wrong and then disappear forever. Sarah knew, with a sudden pang of desperation, that she couldn't let him go. "Wait," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "What's your name?" The man flinched at the direct question, a reaction she recognized from Leo's own social anxieties. He seemed to debate with himself for a second, the internal conflict visible on his face as he stared at the closing doors. He shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, as if to say his name didn't matter. As he turned, preparing to exit at the next stop, the flap of his oversized coat fell open. Pinned to the worn inner lining was a small, laminated ID card from a local hospital, its edges yellowed with age. The photo showed a younger, happier version of him, his hair neater, his eyes less haunted. Sarah's eyes strained to read the text beneath the picture. It was faded, but the letters were still there. David M. Harrison. And below the name, his job title. The words sent a jolt through Sarah's heart. It didn't say maintenance or security. The faded print was unmistakable. Pediatric music therapist. This wasn't just a kind stranger who happened to understand. He was a fallen expert, a professional healer who had lost his most important patient, his own son, and now roamed the city carrying the tools of his trade like sacred relics. David, the man who had de-escalated a meltdown with the precision of a trained therapist, stood by the rear exit as the bus slowed. He was leaving, taking his entire tragic, heroic story with him. Sarah felt a desperate need to connect one last time, to acknowledge that she saw him, not just as a savior, but as a man who was still drowning in his own grief. The silver car remained at Leo's feet, a totem of a connection that transcended words. The bus hissed to a stop, its doors swinging open onto a busy Chicago street corner. David stepped onto the curb without looking back, ready to be swallowed by the afternoon crowd. What do you do when a hero doesn't want to be thanked? Do you respect their wish to disappear, or do you owe it to them to acknowledge the piece of their soul they just left behind? Let me know in the comments what you would do in Sarah's place. The doors hissed shut behind David, sealing the cool, stale air of the bus back inside, leaving Sarah staring through the smudged glass at his retreating figure. He moved with a lumbering, heavy gait, his head down, shoulders hunched against invisible burdens, disappearing into the chaotic tapestry of the city sidewalk. It felt wrong, physically painful, to let him walk away into oblivion after he had just stitched the unraveling seams of her world back together with nothing but a toy car and quiet dignity. Sarah looked down at the silver Mustang in Leo's hand. He was spinning the wheels again. But now there was a softness to his movements, a reverence she had never seen before. It wasn't just a toy anymore. It was a relic, a passed torch from a man who had burned out trying to light the way for someone else, and she felt the weight of that legacy settling into her own bones. The bus lurched forward, merging back into traffic, and for the first time in forever, the motion didn't feel like a trap, but a journey toward something new. Sarah looked around the bus again, expecting the spell to break, for the passengers to return to their digital islands of isolation, but the energy had permanently shifted. The businessman was no longer scrolling. He was watching Leo with a guarded curiosity, perhaps rethinking every interaction he'd ever had with someone different in his corporate world. The grandmother smiled at Sarah, a genuine, crinkled expression of solidarity that said, "I saw that, and I won't forget it," creating a silent pact between them. They were all witnesses to a quiet miracle, a moment where the harsh, grinding gears of the city had stopped for a second to let humanity breathe. Sarah realized that David hadn't just saved Leo, he had saved them all from their own apathy, waking them from a deep, selfish slumber. Leo suddenly looked up from the car, his eyes scanning the empty space where the giant had stood, his gaze piercing through the lingering exhaust fumes. "Big man," he said, his voice clear and devoid of the usual stutter that plagued him when he was stressed, surprising even himself. "Big man. Sad sounds. Dull." It was a profound observation from a boy who rarely spoke about emotions, cutting straight to the heart of the matter with laser precision. He hadn't just heard David's words. He had felt the frequency of the man's grief, vibrating in the air like a discordant note in a melody that demanded resolution. Sarah grabbed her grocery bags, her decision crystallizing in an instant, overriding fear and logic, driven by a sudden, fierce necessity. She couldn't let the sad sounds be the end of David's song. She had to find a way to resolve the cord he had left hanging in the air. She pulled the cord for the next stop, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that matched the frantic urgency of her thoughts. The bus wasn't scheduled to stop for another 3 blocks, But she didn't care about the walk or the melting frozen peas in her bag. "Come on, Leo," she whispered, grabbing his hand with a firmness that signaled adventure rather than danger, infusing her voice with a calm she didn't feel. "We have to go. We have a mission." Leo didn't protest. He simply clutched the silver Mustang tighter, sensing the shift in his mother's energy and trusting her implicit direction. He trusted her steering, even if he didn't understand the map, because today she wasn't just his mother, she was his co-pilot. They stepped off onto the hot pavement, the city noise rushing back in, but this time it didn't sound like chaos. It sounded like a clue. They backtracked, walking briskly against the flow of pedestrians, Sarah's eyes scanning every alleyway and storefront for a glimpse of that dirty winter coat. The heat was oppressive, shimmering off the asphalt, making the air ripple and distort, turning the city into a mirage that threatened to swallow him whole. Doubt began to creep in. What was she doing? Chasing a stranger who clearly wanted to be left alone? Was she crossing a line? What would she even say if she found him? "Thank you" seemed too small, and "I'm sorry about your son" seemed too intrusive for a sidewalk conversation. But the image of that ID card, the pediatric music therapist title fading under laminated plastic, pushed her forward like a beacon. It was proof that he wasn't just a random tragedy. He was a wasted resource, a dormant volcano of kindness that had gone cold. Then she saw him. He was sitting on a bench in a small concrete park tucked between two towering glass office buildings, a forgotten island in a sea of commerce. He wasn't wearing his headphones now. They sat on his lap like a dormant collar, a piece of armor temporarily discarded. He was staring at a pigeon pecking at a crumb on the ground, his face a mask of absolute crushing stillness that bordered on catatonia. It was the posture of a man waiting for a train that would never come, a man who had resigned himself to being a spectator in life rather than a participant. Sarah slowed her pace, signaling Leo to be quiet with a gentle squeeze of his hand. They were entering his territory now, and she knew from the bus that sudden movements were the enemy. She had to approach him not as a woman approaching a stranger, but as a mother approaching a wounded heart. David didn't look up as they approached. His gaze remained fixed on the concrete, as if the patterns in the pavement held the secrets of the universe. Sarah stopped a few feet away, respecting the invisible perimeter he had drawn around himself, waiting for him to acknowledge their presence. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the park's single, struggling tree. She noticed his hands were still shaking, tremors that spoke of a nervous system constantly firing on overdrive, exhausted by its own vigilance. He looked smaller here, without the confines of the bus to frame him, just a man lost in a coat that was too big for his shrinking life. It was a heartbreaking tableau of loneliness, a vivid portrait of how society discards what it doesn't understand. "The wheels are still spinning," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence with a statement of fact rather than a greeting. She pointed to the silver car in Leo's hand, which was indeed still turning, a testament to the physics of hope. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide and startled, the blue irises clouded with a momentary confusion before recognition dawned. He looked from the car to Leo, and then, reluctantly, to Sarah, his guard instantly going back up. "You shouldn't be here," he mumbled, his voice rough, unused to extended conversation. I have to go." He started to rise, panic flaring in his posture, the instinct to flee overriding any desire for connection. "Please don't," Sarah said, stepping forward just enough to be an obstacle but not a threat, putting herself between him and the exit. "You dropped something." It was a lie, a desperate gambit to keep him there for 10 more seconds. David patted his pockets instinctively, a reflex born of anxiety, checking for his wallet, his keys, his sanity. "I didn't drop anything," he said, his brow furrowing as he scanned the ground around his feet. "I check my pockets 3 times. I always check 3 times. The ritualistic compulsion was evident in his voice, a glimpse into the structured chaos of his mind. "You dropped your guard," Sarah said, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. And you dropped this. She held out not an object, but a piece of paper she had scribbled on while walking, her phone number on a grocery receipt. My son smiled today for the first time in weeks because of you. That's not nothing. David looked at the paper as if it were a bomb, unsure whether to defuse it or run from it. He wasn't used to people pursuing him for kindness. He was used to people chasing him away for being strange. Leo stepped forward then, bypassing the adult conversation entirely. He held out the silver car to David, not to give it back, but to show him something. He pointed to a small scratch on the hood. "Battle scar," Leo said, repeating a phrase he must have heard in a cartoon, recontextualizing the damage. David froze. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, a crack in the mask. "Yes," David whispered, his voice trembling. "It survived the crash, just like us." The connection was re-established, stronger this time because it was voluntary. Sarah saw the opening and took it, sensing that this was the pivotal moment. "You're a therapist, aren't you? I saw your badge." The question hit him like a physical blow, causing him to flinch and look away, shame flooding his features. "I was," he corrected, the past tense heavy with regret. "I haven't worked since my son." He couldn't finish the sentence, the grief choking him off. "I'm not safe. I'm too loud inside." "Maybe," Sarah said, her voice fierce with conviction. "Or maybe you're the only one who knows the language." She sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a safe distance between them, respecting his space while offering her presence. "Leo needs someone who speaks car. He needs someone who understands spin. I can't teach him that. I'm just his mom. I love him, but I don't hear the world like you do." It was a plea, naked and honest, stripping away the pretense of normalcy. David looked at Leo, who was now driving the car along the back of the bench, making soft engine noises. He watched the boy's fingers, the precise way he handled the toy, the focus in his eyes. He saw himself 40 years ago. He saw his son 5 years ago. The timeline of his life collapsed into this single moment. "I can't," he whispered, but the refusal lacked its earlier conviction. "I'm broken." Sarah looked him dead in the eye. "So is the car, but it still rolls perfectly." Have you ever felt broken only to realize that your cracks are exactly where the light enters for someone else? We often hide our scars, thinking they make us weak, but what if they are actually the map someone else needs to find their way home? Share in the comments if you've ever turned your pain into power for someone else. David reached out, his hand shaking, and took the receipt from Sarah's hand. He didn't promise anything. He didn't smile. But he put the paper in his pocket, right next to the red car. The walk back to their small apartment felt different that afternoon, as if the city's gray concrete had been infused with a hidden spectrum of color only Sarah and Leo could perceive. Sarah held Leo's hand, not with the usual vice grip of anxiety, but with a gentle reassurance, noticing how he rhythmically squeezed back in time with his steps. The encounter with David had acted like a tuning fork, realigning the chaotic frequencies of their lives into a momentary harmony that she was terrified to lose. She kept checking her pocket, half expecting the memory of the man in the winter coat to dissolve like a dream, but the absence of the grocery receipt was proof. She had planted a seed in a frozen wasteland, and now the agonizing wait began to see if the soil was too cold to let it grow. Every time her phone buzzed in her purse, her heart leaped into her throat, hoping for a stranger's number, but it was just spam or bill reminders. Days turned into a week, and the silence from David became a physical weight, heavier than the humidity that still smothered Chicago. Sarah went through the motions of her double shifts, wiping down diner tables and forcing smiles for rude customers, but her mind was constantly replaying that scene on the bus. She watched Leo closely, looking for signs of regression, fearing that the incident with the bullies had left a scar she couldn't see. But surprisingly, Leo was calmer. He kept the silver Mustang on his nightstand, treating it like a sacred totem. Before bed, he would spin its wheels exactly 3 times, a new ritual that seemed to replace his usual night terrors with a focused, quiet peace. It was as if the car held a charge of David's protective energy, acting as a silent guardian while he slept. Then, on a Tuesday evening that smelled of rain and exhaust, the phone finally rang with a number Sarah didn't recognize. She stared at the screen, her hands damp with sudden sweat, the kitchen noises around her fading into a dull buzz. When she answered, there was a long, static-filled silence on the other end, the kind of hesitation that speaks volumes about the effort it takes to just exist. "Hello?" she whispered, terrified of scaring the caller away, keeping her voice as soft as the hum of a spinning wheel. It's David," the voice rasped, sounding rusty and unsure, as if he hadn't used a telephone in years. I found a track for the car, a track that doesn't have friction." The conversation was awkward, filled with pauses and heavy breaths, but to Sarah, it was the most beautiful dialogue she had ever heard. David wasn't calling to socialize. He was calling to solve a problem, staying safely within the parameters of the mission Leo had inadvertently assigned him. He explained, in rapid-fire bursts of technical detail, that he had built a ramp using specific angles to minimize noise and maximize velocity. He didn't ask how she was. He simply stated that the physics of the ramp were correct and that Leo needed to see the data. It was his way of reaching out, bypassing the emotional minefield of small talk and connecting through the safe, structured language of mechanics and special interests. They agreed to meet at the public library, a neutral ground chosen by David because the acoustics are controlled, and the whispering rules made him feel safe. Sarah arrived 20 minutes early, her stomach doing flips, wondering if she was crazy for pinning her hopes on a man who clearly struggled to function. But when David walked in, he looked different. He had shaved, revealing a jawline that was strong but tense, and though he still wore the coat, it was unbuttoned. He was carrying a large, flat cardboard box with the reverence of someone transporting the crown jewels. He didn't wave. He just nodded once, a sharp, military-like gesture, and headed straight for a table in the back corner. Leo saw him and froze, his eyes widening, but instead of hiding behind Sarah, he took a step forward, drawn by the magnetic pull of shared understanding. David placed the box on the table and opened it to reveal a meticulously constructed wooden ramp system, sanded to perfection. "Maple wood," David said without preamble, looking at Leo's chest rather than his eyes. "Maple absorbs high-frequency treble. It makes the roll deeper, soother." He pulled out the red car from his pocket and placed it at the top. The car glided down the track in almost total silence, a smooth, hypnotic motion that was incredibly satisfying to watch. Leo let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days, a soft ooh of pure delight that made the librarian look up and smile. He immediately reached into his pocket for the silver Mustang, placing it at the top of the ramp next to David's red one. For the next hour, there were no words spoken between the man and the boy, only the rhythmic whoosh of cars and the occasional adjustment of the track. It was a conversation in motion, a dialogue of physics where they were perfectly fluent and the rest of the world was illiterate. Sarah sat back watching them, tears pricking her eyes as she realized David wasn't just playing. He was teaching Leo how to regulate his own nervous system. David began to murmur low instructions, not commands but observations. "If you push too hard, it rattles. Let gravity do the work. Gravity is consistent." Leo mimicked him, adjusting his grip, learning that he didn't have to force things to make them work, a lesson that applied to life as much as to toy cars. Sarah saw the tension leaving David's shoulders too. In helping Leo, he was stepping out of his own internal prison, finding a purpose that quieted the noise in his head. He wasn't the broken man from the bus. He was a mentor, a master craftsman passing down secret knowledge to an apprentice. The library, usually a place of solitary study, became a sanctuary of connection. "He has perfect pitch," David said suddenly to Sarah, not looking up from the track. "The way he hums. It's a perfect A-flat. Did you know that?" Sarah shook her head, stunned. She had always just thought of it as noise, as a symptom to be managed, not a talent to be nurtured. "It's not a symptom," David corrected gently, as if reading her mind. "It's a tuning mechanism. He's trying to tune the world to make it stop hurting. I can show him how to use it." It was the first time anyone had ever framed Leo's autism as a skill set rather than a deficit. That afternoon marked the beginning of a strange, beautiful routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, physics club convened in the back of the library. David started bringing other things, tuning forks, metronomes, textured fabrics for Leo to touch. He was cautiously building a sensory toolkit for the boy, giving him weapons to fight the sensory overload that the world inflicted on them. But Sarah noticed something else happening. David was changing too. He started making eye contact with her for a few seconds at a time. He started wearing a lighter jacket. He was re-entering the world, using Leo as his anchor. One evening, as they were packing up, David paused, his hand hovering over the wooden ramp. "My son," he started, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet stacks. "He loved the library. But I stopped coming after. He looked at Leo, who was happily humming his A-flat while putting the cars away. "Coming back here, it hurts. But it's a good hurt, like a muscle stretching." Sarah reached out and covered his hand with hers, just for a second. "Thank you for stretching for him," she said. David didn't pull away this time. He just looked at his hand, surprised, as if he had forgotten that human touch could be anything other than painful. But the world outside the library wasn't as controlled as David's maple ramps, and reality has a way of crashing into safe spaces. As they left the building that evening, the sky had turned a bruised purple, signaling a storm. The sudden clap of thunder was deafening, a sonic boom that shook the pavement. Leo screamed, dropping to the ground, hands over his ears. But it was David who reacted most violently. He crumpled, not out of fear, but out of a flashback, the noise triggering a memory so visceral it knocked him to his knees. He curled into a ball, rocking frantically, lost in a time and place Sarah couldn't reach. Sarah was paralyzed for a heartbeat, torn between her screaming son and the man who had become their lifeline, both of them drowning in the noise. Passers-by started to stare, phones coming out to record the freak show of a man and a boy melting down on the sidewalk. But then, Sarah saw Leo stop screaming. He saw David on the ground. And in a moment that defied everything Sarah knew about her son's empathy, Leo crawled over to the giant, shaking man. He didn't hug him. He didn't speak. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver Mustang, and placed it on David's knee. Then he started to hum. A perfect, steady A-flat. Have you ever witnessed a role reversal where the person who usually needs help becomes the healer? It challenges everything we think we know about strength and vulnerability. In that moment, the child became the anchor, proving that empathy isn't always about words. Sometimes it's just about being the only one who knows the tune. If you've ever been saved by someone unexpected, tell us your story in the comments. The hum cut through the thunder, a beacon in the storm, calling David back from the edge. The thunderstorm raged above them, a chaotic symphony of booming thunder and relentless rain that turned the sidewalk into a gray river. But inside the small circle formed by Leo and David, the world had narrowed down to a single, vibrating note. Leo's A-flat hum wasn't just a sound. It was a lifeline thrown into the abyss where David was drowning. The boy pressed his forehead against David's wet coat, not seeking comfort, but offering it, his small body acting as a grounding rod for the man's overloaded nervous system. The passers-by with their phones lowered them slowly, the spectacle of a freak-out, dissolving into a tableau of raw, undeniable human connection that felt almost sacrilegious to film. Sarah stood guard over them, soaking wet, using her umbrella not to shield herself, but to create a dome over the two most important men in her life, realizing with a fierce clarity that this was what family looked like. messy, loud, and inextricably bound by shared storms. David's rocking began to slow, syncing imperceptibly with the rhythm of Leo's humming, his breathing hitching as he fought his way back to the present moment. His eyes, wide and terrified a moment ago, focused on the silver Mustang perched precariously on his knee, its wheels slick with rain, but still holding their promise of motion. He reached out a trembling hand, his large, rough fingers brushing against Leo's small, soft ones, anchoring himself in the tactile reality of the now. "A flat," David croaked, his voice cracking like dry wood. It's the key of peace." He closed his eyes, not to hide, but to listen, letting the boy's voice wash over the jagged edges of his trauma like a soothing balm. It was a pivotal reversal. The mentor had become the student, learning that he didn't always have to be the strong one, that he was allowed to be held by the very fragility he sought to protect. The storm eventually grumbled its way east, leaving behind the smell of wet concrete and ozone, a scent that felt like a fresh start. David sat up slowly, wiping the rain from his face with a hand that was steadier than it had been in years. He looked at Leo with an expression of profound awe, as if seeing the boy for the first time not as a child to be saved, but as a peer, a fellow traveler who knew the secret paths through the dark woods. "You brought me back," David whispered, the confession hanging heavy in the humid air. Leo didn't respond with words. He simply picked up his car, spun the wheel once, and gave David a rare, direct smile that lit up the gloom better than any street lamp. It was an acknowledgement of their new dynamic. They were no longer just a teacher and a student. They were partners in survival. Sarah helped David to his feet, her hand lingering on his arm for a moment longer than necessary, transmitting a silent message of, "I've got you." They walked to a nearby diner, the neon sign buzzing with a comforting familiarity, seeking warmth and coffee to chase away the chill of the rain and the adrenaline crash. Inside, the booth felt like a safe haven, the smell of grease and coffee grounding them in the mundane. David stared into his black coffee, the steam rising around his face, and for the first time, he began to talk about him. Not just my son, but Ethan. He spoke of Ethan's obsession with ceiling fans, his laugh that sounded like a hiccup, and the way he used to smell like vanilla and old paper. He reclaimed his son from the tragedy, painting him back into existence with words, and Sarah listened, bearing witness to the resurrection of a memory that had been buried under guilt for too long. "I thought I had to fix him," David admitted, his voice low, addressing the sugar dispenser. "I thought if I could just make him normal, he would be safe. But I was wrong. I was trying to tune a violin to sound like a trumpet." He looked up at Sarah, his eyes clear and devastatingly sad. "You don't do that with Leo. You let him be a violin. That's brave." Sarah felt a tear slide down her cheek, realizing that this man, who had lost everything, was validating her deepest insecurity, that she wasn't doing enough. In his brokenness, he was offering her a wholeness she hadn't known she needed. The validation from someone who truly knew the stakes was worth more than 1,000 parenting books. As weeks turned into months, the physics club expanded beyond the library walls. David started coming to their apartment for dinner, bringing with him not just sensory tools, but a quiet, steady presence that filled the empty spaces in their home. He fixed the leaky faucet because the dripping sound was a torture rhythm, and he reorganized Leo's bookshelf by color spectrum, which made Leo shriek with delight. They became a unit, a patchwork family stitched together by neurodivergence and resilience. But the real test came when the school called. Leo was being considered for a transfer to a specialized facility that Sarah knew was just a warehouse for kids the system didn't want to deal with. The principal cited disruptive behavior and inability to integrate, using bureaucratic language to mask their lack of effort. Sarah was panicked, ready to fight, but feeling outgunned by the administrators and their thick binders of complaints. She asked David to come with her to the meeting, not as a therapist, but as moral support. David hesitated, the old fear of institutions flickering in his eyes. Schools were where he had failed Ethan, where the system had chewed them up. But he looked at Leo, who was calmly building a tower of blocks in the corner, and the fear was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He put on his winter coat, not as armor to hide behind, but as a uniform of war. "They don't know the data," David said, grabbing a notebook. "We will show them the data." The meeting room was sterile and smelled of floor wax and judgment. The principal, a woman with a tight smile and tired eyes, sat behind a desk piled high with paperwork, flanked by a school psychologist who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They started listing Leo's incidents, humming in class, refusing to sit in circle time, the meltdown during the fire drill. They painted a picture of a broken child who was a burden to the collective. Sarah felt herself shrinking, the familiar shame creeping up her throat, until David stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't flip the table. He simply opened his notebook and laid it gently on the principal's desk. "This is not a list of failures," David said, his voice deep and vibrating with authority. "This is a user manual you refuse to read." He pointed to a graph he had drawn. His humming increases at 10:01 a.m. Why? Because the fluorescent lights buzz at a frequency that peaks at that time. It's a physical assault on his brain. He hums to block the pain. You call it disruption. I call it self-defense. The psychologist sat up, intrigued. The principal stopped smiling. David continued, dismantling their arguments one by one with the precision of a surgeon, translating Leo's behaviors into logical, physiological responses to a hostile environment. He wasn't pleading for mercy. He was demanding competence. "You see a child who won't sit in a circle," David said, leaning in, his blue eyes blazing. "I see a child who can calculate the trajectory of a moving object within 3 degrees of accuracy. I see a child with perfect pitch who uses sound to map his emotional landscape. If you send him away, you aren't protecting the class. You are discarding a genius because you are too lazy to change the light bulbs." The room went silent. The principal looked at the psychologist, then at the graph, and finally at Sarah. The dynamic had shifted. They weren't dealing with a desperate mother anymore. They were dealing with an expert witness who spoke the language of the forgotten. Have you ever seen someone stand up to a system that was designed to crush them, armed only with the truth and a fierce love? It's a reminder that advocacy isn't always about being loud. Sometimes it's about being undeniably right. David didn't just save Leo's spot in the school that day. He rewrote the narrative of what that school could be. If you've ever had to fight for someone's right to belong, share your victory in the comments. As they walked out of the school, the sun broke through the clouds, and David took a deep breath, looking lighter than Sarah had ever seen him. The victory at the school was seismic, shifting the tectonic plates of their small world, but as winter approached, bringing with it the biting Chicago wind, a new challenge emerged from the shadows. David began to withdraw. It wasn't the sudden, fearful retreat of the past, but a slow, quiet erosion, like a coastline surrendering to the tide. He missed a Tuesday library session, then a Thursday. When Sarah called, his voice sounded thin and distant, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. He blamed a cold or bad weather, but Sarah knew the signs of a depressive spiral when she saw them. The anniversary of Ethan's death was approaching, December 14th, a date that loomed on the calendar like a black hole, threatening to swallow all the light they had carefully gathered over the last few months. Sarah felt a desperate, clawing panic. She had come to rely on David, not just for Leo, but for herself. He was the only person who understood the unspoken language of their lives, the only one who didn't need explanations. Without him, the apartment felt too quiet, the silence filling with the old anxieties. Leo sensed it too. His humming became jagged and discordant, and he started lining up his cars facing the door, a silent vigil for the giant who had stopped coming. Sarah knew she couldn't fix David. She knew that grief was a landscape that had to be traversed alone. But she also knew She couldn't let him freeze to death out there in the wilderness of his memory. She had to do something, but the usual tools of soup and sympathy felt woefully inadequate for a pain this ancient. On the morning of December 14th, the city woke up under a blanket of snow that muffled the streets, turning Chicago into a ghost town. Sarah woke up with a plan that terrified her. It was a risk, a massive overstep that could either pull David back from the brink or shatter the fragile trust they had built. She packed a bag with military precision, a thermos of hot cocoa, a heavy blanket, Leo's silver Mustang, and a small portable record player she had found at a thrift store. She dressed Leo in his warmest clothes, explaining simply, "We're going to find David. He's stuck in the sad sounds." Leo nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the mission. They trudged through the snow to David's building, a grim brick monolith in a part of town where the plows rarely came. Standing in the hallway outside David's apartment, the air smelled of stale tobacco and boiled cabbage. Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. She could hear nothing from inside, no TV, no footsteps, just a terrifying, heavy silence. She knocked, softly at first, then harder. "David, it's Sarah and Leo." No answer. She tried the knob. It was locked. Panic spiked in her chest. She knocked again, leaning her forehead against the cold wood. "David, please. We're not leaving. The car." "The car won't spin right without you." It was a dirty emotional tactic, using Leo as bait, but she was desperate. Minutes dragged by like hours. Just as she was about to call for help, she heard the slow scrape of a deadbolt sliding back. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a slice of David's face that shocked her. He looked gaunt, his eyes sunken and ringed with dark bruises of sleeplessness, his beard overgrown. He was wearing the winter coat indoors, shivering as if the cold was coming from inside his own bones. "Go away," he rasped, avoiding looking at Leo. "Not today, please, not today." He tried to close the door, but Sarah wedged her foot in the gap, a flash of stubborn anger overriding her fear. "Especially today," Sarah said firmly, pushing the door open enough to step inside. The apartment was a tomb. The curtains were drawn, blocking out every photon of light. The air was stagnant and cold. But what broke Sarah's heart was the state of the living room. It was completely empty of furniture, save for a single chair in the center. On the walls, taped up in chaotic, overlapping rows, were hundreds of drawings, all of the same thing. Blue cars, red cars, silver cars. It was a shrine to a memory, a visual echo of the boy he couldn't save. Leo walked in, oblivious to the social awkwardness, drawn immediately to the wall of drawings. He reached out and touched a crayon sketch of a blue Mustang. "Ethan's car," Leo said softly. David flinched as if struck. "Don't," he whispered, backing into the corner, wrapping his arms around himself. "Don't say his name. I can't keep him safe if you say it." It was the logic of grief. Magical thinking that believed silence could preserve the dead. Sarah realized then that David wasn't just grieving. He was haunting himself, trapping his son's memory in amber to keep it from fading. Sarah set up the record player on the floor, ignoring David's protests. "You told me once that music can retune the brain," she said, her hands shaking as she placed the needle on the vinyl. "You said we can change the frequency." The soft crackle of the record filled the room, followed by the opening notes of a cello suite. Deep, mournful, but undeniably beautiful. It was Bach, structured and mathematical, the kind of music David had once said his son loved. "You're drowning in the silence, David," she said gently. "Let the music carry the weight for a minute." David slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands, rocking violently. The music seemed to physically hurt him, peeling back the scabs he had carefully cultivated over years of numbness. Leo, watching this, did something extraordinary. He picked up one of the drawings, a blue car, and brought it to David. He sat down next to him, shoulder to shoulder, and started to hum along with the cello. It wasn't a perfect harmony. It was a rough, childlike drone, but it bridged the gap between the recording and the reality. He liked this song, David choked out, the tears finally breaking through the dam. He used to conduct with his spoon. He was so happy. Sarah sat on his other side, completing the circuit. "Tell us," she urged softly. "Tell us about the happy. The sad has taken up too much room." And so, in that dark, freezing apartment, David began to speak. He didn't talk about the accident or the guilt. He talked about Ethan's laugh. He talked about how Ethan loved the smell of rain and hated the texture of velvet. He talked until his voice was raw, purging the ghost and reclaiming the boy. Leo, listening to the stories, started to spin the silver Mustang on the floorboards. The rhythmic whir mixed with the cello and David's voice, creating a new soundscape, one of remembrance rather than regret. David watched the spinning wheel, his eyes locking onto the motion. Slowly, tentatively, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the red car. He placed it next to Leo's. "They're racing," David whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Ethan's is winning." Sarah saw the shift happen, the moment the past stopped being a prison and started being a story. She reached into her bag and pulled out the thermos. "Hot chocolate," she announced, breaking the heavy mood with a touch of normalcy, "with extra marshmallows. Because sugar is a necessary fuel for physics." David took the cup, his hand still trembling, but he held it. He took a sip, the warmth spreading through his chest, thawing the ice that had encased his heart for 5 years. "I almost didn't open the door," David confessed later, looking at Sarah over the rim of the cup. "I wanted to disappear." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand hard. "I know, but Leo wouldn't let you. He said the car wouldn't spin right without you, and he was right. We don't spin right without you." It was a declaration of love, not romantic, but something deeper, a declaration of essential necessity. As they left the apartment hours later, David didn't close the door immediately. He stood in the frame, watching them walk down the hallway. He wasn't fixed. Grief doesn't have a fix, but he was open. He looked at the wall of drawings one last time, then reached out and took one down, a picture of a blue car flying over a city. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, taking his son with him into the present, instead of leaving him trapped on the wall. The next day, Sarah found a package outside her door. Inside was a brand new, hand-carved wooden track, more complex than the first, with loops and curves that defied gravity, and a note, written in shaky but legible handwriting. "Friction is inevitable, but if we build the ramp right, we can use it to fly. See you Tuesday. David." Sarah pressed the note to her chest, feeling a lightness she hadn't felt in years. The winter was still cold, but the freeze was over. Have you ever had to break into someone's darkness to pull them back to the light? It's the terrifying, intrusive, necessary work of love. We often think we should give people space when they are grieving, but sometimes space is just another word for abandonment. David needed an invasion to remember he was still part of the living world. If you've ever been the intruder or the rescued, share your story in the comments. The track was set up in the living room, waiting for the seasons turned, melting the gray slush of winter into the hesitant green of spring. And with the thaw came a new rhythm to their lives, steady and dependable as a metronome. The physics club had outgrown the library and moved into a rented community center room, funded by a small grant David had applied for, his first act of professional engagement in half a decade. He wasn't just Leo's giant anymore. He was Mr. Harrison, a man who taught a dozen neurodivergent kids how to build bridges out of popsicle sticks and how to map their emotions using color wheels. Sarah watched from the sidelines, marveling at the transformation, seeing the man who had been a ghost on a bus now conducting a symphony of chaotic, beautiful minds. Yet, beneath the newfound purpose, she sensed a lingering tension in him, a final locked door he hadn't yet opened. One Tuesday, after the other children had left, David asked Sarah and Leo to stay behind, his hands fidgeting with a loose button on his coat. A coat he now wore open, revealing a clean-pressed shirt underneath. "There is one more test," he said, his voice tight with an anxiety Sarah hadn't heard in months. "A field test, for the cars, and for us." He explained that there was a spot, a specific hill in the city park overlooking the lake, where he and Ethan used to race their cars every Sunday. He hadn't been back to that hill since the accident. It was ground zero of his memories, the place where the ghost of his son was most vivid. And returning there was terrifying. Sarah didn't hesitate. "When do we go?" she asked, her voice steady, offering him the anchor he needed. They chose the following Sunday, a day that dawned bright and crisp, the sky a piercing, limitless blue that seemed to demand courage. The car ride to the park was quiet, filled with a heavy, expectant silence, broken only by Leo humming a new tune, a major key, bright and hopeful. David drove with white-knuckled grip, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror as if checking to see if his past was following them. When they parked, David sat in the car for a long time, staring at the green slope that rose in the distance, his breathing shallow and rapid. "We don't have to do this," Sarah said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "We can just go get ice cream." David shook his head, a sharp, jerky motion. "No, the loop is incomplete. I have to close the loop." It was a physicist's way of describing closure, framing emotional healing as a structural necessity. He opened the door and stepped out, the wind catching his coat, making him look like a weary traveler bracing for one last mountain. Leo hopped out, clutching his silver Mustang and David's red one, oblivious to the ghosts, seeing only a perfect hill for gravity experiments. The climb was slow. David stopped every few yards, looking at a tree, a bench, a patch of grass, cataloging the changes, overlaying the present reality onto the map of his memory. He fell there once. David pointed to a cluster of roots. He didn't cry. He just checked his knees for damage and kept running. He smiled, a painful, fragile thing. He was tougher than me. Sarah walked beside him, silent, letting him lead the procession, serving as the witness he needed to validate that those memories were real, not just phantoms of grief. When they reached the top, the view was breathtaking, the city skyline shimmering against the water, the world spread out below them like a chaotic, beautiful quilt. David stood at the crest, the wind whipping his hair, tears streaming freely down his face. He wasn't sobbing. He was just letting the pain flow out, a silent release of pressure that had built up for years. Leo tugged on his coat. "Ready?" the boy asked, holding up the cars. David looked down, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "Ready," he whispered, his voice cracking. They lined up the cars, the silver Mustang, the red one, and a third one David pulled from his pocket, a blue one, pristine and untouched. "This was his," David said, his voice trembling but clear. "He never got to race it. It was a birthday present for the week after." He placed the blue car in the center. "3 lanes," he said to Leo. "No friction." Leo nodded, understanding the solemnity of the ritual. "On your mark," Leo announced, taking charge. "Get set, go." The 3 cars took off, gathering speed as they hurtled down the paved path, sunlight glinting off their metal bodies. They stayed neck and neck, a blur of silver, red, and blue, racing toward the bottom of the hill where the path curved out of sight. David watched them go, his body leaning forward, urging them on, his face transforming from grief to a fierce, childlike wonder. For a moment, he wasn't a grieving father or a broken man. He was just a racer, caught in the thrill of velocity. "Look at them fly!" David shouted, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that startled a nearby flock of pigeons into flight. "Go! Go!" The blue car, perhaps because of its slightly heavier frame or just the whims of physics, pulled ahead in the final stretch, crossing the imaginary finish line first before tumbling into the grass. David let out a whoop of triumph, throwing his arms in the air. "He won! He finally won! He turned to Sarah, his face flushed, eyes shining with life. Did you see that? He won! They ran down the hill to retrieve the cars, laughing, breathless, the heavy cloak of tragedy shedding with every step. When David picked up the blue car, he didn't put it back in his pocket. He handed it to Leo. He would want you to have this, David said, his voice thick with emotion. A car isn't meant to stay in a box. It's meant to roll. Leo took the car with reverent hands, spinning its wheels. Fast, Leo said. Very fast. Sarah watched them, her heart swelling until she thought it might burst. She realized that David hadn't just closed a loop, he had expanded the circle. He had invited Leo into the sacred space of his son's memory, not to replace Ethan, but to carry his torch. The blue car wasn't a relic anymore. It was a toy again, alive and kinetic in the hands of a boy who needed it. As they walked back to the car, David stopped and looked back at the hill. The ghosts were gone. It was just a hill now, a place of grass and wind and gravity. He put his arm around Sarah's shoulders, a gesture of intimacy he had never initiated before, and pulled her close for a second. Thank you, he whispered into her hair, for driving me here. Sarah leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. You drove yourself, David. I just read the map. That night, for the first time in 5 years, David didn't sleep in the chair in his living room. He slept in his bed, and in Sarah's apartment, Leo slept with 3 cars on his nightstand, silver, red, and blue, parked in a perfect row, engines cold but ready for the next race. The past had been honored, the present was safe, and the future was a wide open track waiting for them to release the brakes. Have you ever visited a place that held your deepest pain and found that you could leave some of it behind? Returning to the scene of our trauma is one of the hardest things we can do, but sometimes it's the only way to rewrite the ending. David didn't erase his grief on that hill. He transformed it into a finish line. If you've ever reclaimed a memory, tell us how in the comments. The race was over, but the journey was just beginning. 1 year after the incident on the bus, Sarah found herself sitting in the front row of a small auditorium at the city's community college, her hands twisting a program into a tight spiral. The stage was empty, except for a microphone stand and a single stool. Beside her, Leo was wearing a clip-on tie he had insisted on choosing himself, bright orange with tiny cars on it, and he was practically vibrating with excitement. He wasn't stimming out of anxiety today. He was stimming out of anticipation. He leaned over to Sarah and whispered loudly, Mr. Harrison is going to talk about the frequency of brave. Sarah smiled, smoothing his hair, her heart pounding a rhythm of pride and nerves that felt like a drum solo. David walked onto the stage. He didn't stride with the easy confidence of a motivational speaker. He walked with the deliberate, heavy steps of a man who checks the floor for cracks. He was wearing a suit that fit him well, though he still had a small, comforting fidget spinner palmed in his left hand. He adjusted the microphone, the feedback whine making him wince for a split second before he composed himself. He looked out into the audience, a sea of parents, educators, and neurodivergent individuals, and for a moment, the old panic flickered in his eyes. Then he found Leo in the front row. Leo gave him a thumbs up. David took a deep breath, and the panic receded, replaced by purpose. My name is David, he began, his voice deep and resonant, filling the room without shouting. And for a long time, I thought I was broken. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. I thought the world was too loud, too bright, too sharp. I thought my son, Ethan, was broken too. A murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd. We are taught that if a machine makes a noise it's not supposed to, you fix it, you silence it. But human beings are not machines. We are instruments. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a note card, but the silver Mustang. He held it up to the light. This car saved my life, he said simply. Not because it's valuable, but because it speaks a language that doesn't need words. It speaks the language of spin, of physics, of consistency in a chaotic world. He turned the wheel, the tiny whir amplified by the microphone, a sound that was familiar to half the room and strange to the other. We spend so much time trying to force square pegs into round holes that we forget we can just build a new board. David spoke for 40 minutes. He talked about sensory overload not as a defect, but as a heightened state of data processing. He talked about meltdowns as system reboots. He talked about the bus ride, the moment he stood up not as a hero, but as a desperate mirror to a boy in pain. He didn't paint himself as a savior. He painted himself as a survivor who had been pulled back from the edge by a single mom and a boy who hummed in A-flat. "I didn't save them," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "They woke me up." The climax of the speech wasn't a booming declaration, but a quiet invitation. "I used to cover my ears," David said, lowering his voice. "I used to hide. But now I listen." He gestured to the wings of the stage and a screen descended. A video began to play. It was grainy, shot on a phone, showing a group of children in the community center, the physics club. They were building ramps, laughing, flapping their hands, rocking, humming. It was a symphony of neurodivergence, a celebration of unmasked joy. "We are not broken," David's voiceover played. "We are just tuned to a different frequency." When the video ended, the room was silent for a heartbeat, and then it exploded. It wasn't polite applause. It was a standing ovation that shook the floorboards. People were crying, cheering, standing up to show their support. But David didn't bask in it. He walked to the edge of the stage and held out his hand to Leo. Sarah nodded, giving him a gentle push. Leo ran up the stairs and took David's hand. They stood there together, the giant and the boy, the teacher and the student, the past and the future, bowing to a world that was finally starting to listen. After the speech, they were mobbed. Parents wanted to thank him. Teachers wanted his curriculum. Kids wanted to see the car. David handled it with a grace Sarah hadn't seen before, taking breaks when he needed to, using his noise-canceling headphones for a minute to reset, then diving back in. He was managing his limits, not hiding from them. Sarah stood back, watching him navigate the crowd, realizing that the man in the winter coat was gone forever. In his place was a lighthouse keeper, tending the flame for all the ships lost at sea. As the crowd thinned, a woman approached David. She was holding the hand of a young girl who was wearing headphones and looking at the floor. "My daughter," the woman said, her voice trembling. She spins things. I tried to stop her." David knelt down immediately, ignoring the adults. He looked at the girl. "Do you like the spin?" he asked softly. The girl peeked out from her hair and nodded. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a brand new green car. "Green is for growth," he said, handing it to her. "Spin it as much as you need. It helps the world stay still." The woman burst into tears, thanking him profusely. David stood up and looked at Sarah. "That was me," he whispered. "That was Ethan." Sarah took his hand. "And now, it's just a girl with a green car. You changed the ending, David." He squeezed her hand. "No, we wrote a sequel." They walked out of the auditorium into the late afternoon sun. The city was loud, sirens, traffic, construction. But it didn't feel hostile anymore. It was just noise, and inside the noise, they had their own signal. Leo walked between them, holding both their hands, swinging his arms. He looked up at David. "Physics club tomorrow." David smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. "Physics club tomorrow. We have to test the new loop-de-loop." The story of the bus wasn't just a viral moment or a touching anecdote. It was the spark that lit a fire, burning down the walls of isolation David had built around himself. It proved that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply stand up and say, "I am like you." It proved that broken pieces, when fit together, make a stained glass window that is more beautiful than clear glass ever could be. Leo let go of their hands and ran ahead to chase a pigeon, his laughter ringing out clear and bright. Sarah and David stopped to watch him. "He's going to be okay," David said, not as a hope, but as a fact. "Because he has a map now." Sarah looked at David. "He has a navigator." David looked at the sky. "He has a crew." Have you ever found your crew in the most unlikely place? Sometimes the family we need isn't the one we're born into, but the one we build out of shared scars and mutual understanding. David, Sarah, and Leo proved that love is just physics, a force that pulls bodies together against the gravity of loneliness. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to know they aren't broken. And remember, never underestimate the power of a spinning wheel. We all know what it's like to feel judged, to feel like the world is too loud, or to worry that we, or someone we love, just doesn't fit into the boxes society has built. But as David, Sarah, and Leo showed us, being different isn't a defect. It's just a different kind of music. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help spread their message of acceptance. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that reminds you that you are not alone. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where a stranger's kindness changed your entire day, or maybe even your life? Let's build our own supportive community right here, one comment at a time.